Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for attending here today. My name is Tran Mendez, and I am with the Center for Teaching and Learning. And today's session is being hosted by School of Education faculty, Dr. Linda Bloomberg, and her topic is Trustworthiness in Qualitative Research. Before we get started, I just have a couple of housekeeping items. If you could please use the chat box and the Q&A box to submit your questions, I will make sure that Dr. Bloomberg is able to address them with you here today. And in the event that we don't have enough time to go over all of your questions, just submit them to ctl@ncu.edu, and I will get them over to Dr. Bloomberg for you. And the session is also being recorded, and I will post it in the comments within the next 24 hours for you to view. And then this way you will have access to the recording to refer back to at a later date and time, as well as the PowerPoint presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Bloomberg.
Thanks so much, Tran, and hi everybody, and welcome to this webinar, which I hope will be extremely useful to you with your dissertation research. It is a topic that is highly debated and highly spoken about, and so I think it applies to everybody who's doing qualitative studies. So thanks for attending, and as Tran said, please come with any and all questions. I'm happy to address them to the extent possible. And I will be stopping at a few points along the way to take those questions and address them. So thank you once again. The topic, as you know, is addressing standards of trustworthiness in qualitative research. I just want to go over what the objectives and outcomes of today's presentation are so that it's really clear to you how and why I presented what I have prepared for our afternoon discussion here. Firstly, the webinar will introduce students and faculty to the following aspects. One is the 4 standards of trustworthiness that characterize qualitative research, the significance of each of these 4 standards, ways in which these standards differ from quantitative research standards, which is really important, and I'm going to be going into quite some detail with that. And then fourth, strategies for addressing each of these qualitative standards of trustworthiness. The intended outcomes of this presentation is that everybody will better understand what constitutes each of the 4 standards of trustworthiness that characterize qualitative research, that everybody will also better understand the significance of addressing trustworthiness in qualitative research, that is the reason for addressing these issues, understand how and in what ways trustworthiness standards of qualitative research differ from similar standards in quantitative research. Again, as I said, that's a pretty important point to consider. And then also, hopefully, everybody will be receiving guidelines, suggestions, and tips to most responsibly, ethically, and effectively address issues of trustworthiness in a qualitative research study, which will be your dissertation, ultimately. So, just to start off, I'd like to take a step back and look at what reliability and validity in quantitative research mean. Valid research, or validity, addresses the phenomenon that is being described in terms of its accuracy. So in other words, valid research would accurately reflect the phenomenon being described. So accuracy is the key point there. Reliability is somewhat different. Reliability means that 2 researchers who are studying the same phenomenon will have compatible or similar findings. That would make the research reliable. So those are the 2 standards that are very important in quantitative research, validity and reliability. However, there are some fundamental differences between qualitative and quantitative research on many, many levels, and one of them specifically being this very issue, standards of trustworthiness. So in qualitative research, the researcher is often referred to as the instrument. In other words, the researcher, her or himself, is the instrument that collects data and analyzes data. There is no tool, such as a test, to do so. The researcher applies the methods that will gather data and analyze data. Second, criteria for evaluating qualitative research focus on how well the researcher has provided evidence that the descriptions and analysis represent the reality of the situations and persons being studied. This is really important in qualitative research because we understand as researchers that it is not only the researcher's voice that counts, it's the voice of the participants. In other words, how well are we representing our participants? And that how well translates into trustworthiness. In other words, can readers of our research trust that we have accurately and appropriately represented the voice of our participants? Now, whereas there are two standards that quantitative research focuses on, reliability and validity, as we just looked at, there are four standards of trustworthiness in qualitative research. And in some ways they parallel, but are not exactly the same, you'll see, as the quantitative standards. The first standard in qualitative research is credibility, and I'm going to be going into each of these in more detail, so this is just the beginning, this is just the outline. So credibility is the first standard, and in some ways this parallels validity in quantitative research, and you'll see why. Remember, validity is how accurate the research is. The second standard of trustworthiness is dependability, and in some ways this parallels reliability in quantitative research. That is, if two researchers conduct the same study, will their findings be similar or comparable? Third is confirmability, which in some ways parallels objectivity in quantitative research. But remember, qualitative research, and we're going to be looking at this in more detail, is not at all concerned with objectivity. In fact, qualitative research clearly acknowledges that a researcher cannot be objective, that a human being can simply not be totally objective, because each of us have our own biases and assumptions that we bring into the research process with us naturally as humans. And so the key for humans to, human researchers to address the reality of the research according to qualitative research standards is to acknowledge their subjectivities and address these, not to claim to be objective. And the fourth standard is transferability, which in some ways, but not exactly, parallels generalizability. And you'll see further on, qualitative research does not claim to be generalizable. It is not a goal of qualitative research to be generalizable and to generalize your research to other situations. Rather, the standard is transferability, and I'm going to be talking about that in a little bit more detail further on. So having said that, it's actually a red flag when researchers will make reference to quantitative standards of trustworthiness in a qualitative study. That is simply incorrect. And this debate has occurred over many, many years of qualitative research being refined by various researchers such as Creswell and Denson and Lincoln, some of the key figures in the field of qualitative research. This ongoing debate about standards of trustworthiness has been an evolving one, but currently where it lands at the moment is that validity and reliability simply do not apply to qualitative research. So when researchers or student researchers make reference to reliability and validity in their qualitative study, this raises the question of whether the researcher is sufficiently familiar with the principles and practice of qualitative research. And clearly, if these terms are being utilized and applied to qualitative research, it means that students or researchers should go back and review the literature on qualitative research to be completely familiar with what is appropriate. That is the four standards of trustworthiness. So that said, I'm going to stop for a moment here before we go into each of these standards in more detail. Tran, I'm not sure if there are any questions at this point, and if there are, I'm very happy to address them.
I don't see any yet. Remember, if you have any questions, at the bottom of your screen, there is a panel, and you can use the Q&A box or you can use the chat box to submit your questions over to me. But I don't see any at this time, Dr. Bloomberg.
Okay. Perfect. But please be sure to note any of your questions down, because as they come to mind, make sure that they are there, so and I can address them at the next point. So let's move on then and look at each of these snaps. Yes, Fran?
Yes, I wanted to let you know that one did come through. It is, what is the purpose of the research if it cannot be generalized?
But that's a really good question. And I think I'd like to hold that question over until we talk about transferability, because you will see the transferability is just another term that is more applicable to qualitative research, but it doesn't mean that your research will not be used or be made useful in other contexts or situations. So the term transferability replaces the term generalizability in qualitative research, but it does not take away the meaning, being that research has to be applicable to other situations or similar circumstances. So I will get to that question, and I hope it'll be made clear in my presentation. But thank you, that's a really good question. Any others?
None that I can see. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you. That is a really good question. I appreciate that. So let's take a look at the first standard of trustworthiness, being credibility. The credibility standard requires that a qualitative study is believable to your readers and is approved by those who provided the information gathered during the study. In other words, your research participants should be able to say, yes, what you have found relates to my experience. So we want readers first and foremost, whether it's your professor or just the general public who are reading your research study, we want people to believe that our research is credible, that it's believable. And so this is the very first standard of trustworthiness. And how do we address or achieve credibility? There are different ways to do this. And these are the different ways that a researcher can engage in order to enhance the credibility of their research. Firstly is prolonged engagement. Being present in the research site long enough to build trust with participants and experience the breadth, and doesn't take place overnight. There is a process that one goes through to conduct the research. You collect the data, you analyze the data, and that process of collecting the data doesn't just happen in flash. You spend some time with your participants. And
It looks like we just lost Dr. Bloomberg. So
no, I'm back.
Okay,
And
there you are.
Oh gosh, I don't know what happened there, but I am here.
Okay, great.
Okay. Sorry for that glitch. Second is triangulation, which means verification of findings.
Dr. Bloomberg, just to interrupt you real quick, I'm so sorry. Your presentation is no longer up, so you'll have to bring it back up for us, please.
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry, Tran. How do I do that?
Do you see your share button at the bottom?
1 second.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, if you can reshare your presentation, it'll come back up. And there it is. And just put it back into presentation mode.
Thank you.
You're
sorry
welcome.
about that. Okay, please point out if that happens again. I'm really sorry about that.
That's okay.
Okay, so let's go back. So the first way to address credibility was prolonged engagement in the field. The second way that I started talking about is triangulation. That means verification of findings through A, referring to multiple sources of information, including the literature, and B, using multiple methods of data collection. Remember, qualitative research cannot be conducted using one single method of data collection like interviews. You do have to use at least 2 and possibly more methods of data collection so that you can triangulate your findings. In other words, you want to show, in order to address credibility, that your findings have been triangulated or accessed through various means, not just one method of data collection. So that is what triangulation refers to. The third way that the researcher can address credibility is through negative case analysis. Now, this is an analytical procedure which involves searching for instances in which in some ways contradict the researcher's assumptions and or expectations. So instead of ignoring findings that seem unexpected, the researcher would actually address these and acknowledge them and describe them. So if your readers understand that you have addressed all the different findings, including the ones that you didn't expect or may not really be partial to, remember, your findings are your findings. You cannot set the findings up in any possible way. The findings must emanate from the actual research. And very often we find through our research some things that don't really resonate with us, or some things that we had not expected to find. We cannot ignore those. They have to be acknowledged and included. So that's what is meant by negative case analysis. Subjectivity checks means that the researcher checks her or his own expectations and assumptions by being transparent and revealing any biases or preferences. Now, usually this takes place in the first chapter of a dissertation, where the researcher talks about her or his assumptions going into the study. Very often, and I encourage this with my students, is to then revisit these assumptions in the final chapter and discuss them in terms of, well, were my assumptions confirmed or disconfirmed? And what are my assumptions now, having done this research? Sometimes our assumptions change, our feelings change once we've gone through an entire dissertation study. Sometimes our insights and our understanding is enhanced or changed in some way. So it's really important for the researcher, especially being the instrument, to keep a check on how you as a human being are progressing through the study in terms of your own feelings, biases, prejudices, and assumptions. A fifth way of addressing credibility is peer debriefing. And this means meeting with a peer or colleague who's willing to ask you probing questions and who is not involved directly in your study. This can be somebody that you work with. It can be somebody professional that you know. And this technique keeps the researcher honest by having someone else independently point out any flaws or limitations with the study. This is really important because remember, involving more than one perspective is always very valuable. So bringing somebody else in who is not really associated with the study allows a second set of eyes on your study, and sometimes some very valuable insights are raised when you engage in this kind of activity. And sixth, member checking means that you actually review the study's findings with the research participants themselves. You give the research participants an opportunity. This is what's called member checking. You give them an opportunity to actually look at the findings of your study and allow them to express their own perspectives and views. Remember, they have given you very valuable information that you have used as the data for your study. If not for them, you would not have the research findings. So it's very valuable to check with them whether these findings match with their expectations and interpretations. Sometimes they may say, I'm not totally in agreement with the way that you've described me, or this is not really my voice, or this is not really the way I see things. Or they may say, this is an excellent interpretation of what I mean or what I said. So remember, checking with them is a very valuable way of ensuring credibility. Your readers will really appreciate that you've gone to the trouble of engaging in some of these different activities here, these 6 different activities that I've listed. If you can show that you've engaged in all 6, then you've really covered all your bases and you've really gone the distance to ensuring the credibility of your study. Sometimes it's not always possible to engage in all 6 of these. Sometimes you don't have an opportunity to go back to your research participants. It's not always possible. So you may leave that one out. But all the others are really important and I would say essential to addressing the credibility of your study. So I'm going to stop there again, just to see if there are any questions about credibility.
Yes, so we had a couple come through. I wanted to ask about the use of the term co-researchers in transcendental phenomenology and how to communicate that use to those reviewing the dissertation proposal.
Can you just say that again, please, Tran? Co-researchers in the use of phenomenological studies. Okay, in dissertation work at NCU and elsewhere, co-researchers are really not encouraged. The student researcher, the doctoral candidate, is the sole researcher. So we generally do not have researchers for dissertation work. Sometimes in postdoctoral work, that is pretty acceptable. I'm not sure that it's wholly applicable only to phenomenology. It could be used in case studies or action research, specifically in action research. Co-researchers are used, but not for doctoral work. Remember, it would be very tedious to get IRB approval for 2 people. The other person would not be a student at this university, so it really is not encouraged or advisable.
And the person added a little bit more. In transcendental phenomenology, the co-researchers at the participants.
The co-researchers are the participants.
It just says, in transcendental phenomenology, the co-researchers are the participants, correct?
Well, in all qualitative research, your participants are co-researchers in a way, because we work with, the researcher works with participants in tandem. So it's not as in quantitative research where we would be doing an experiment or doing a study on somebody. We consider research to be collaborative. So in other words, we're doing research with our participants. Our participants are actually collaboratively working with us to answer our questions and provide their perspectives, but they're still not really called co-researchers. They're still research participants. So if that person would like, I would suggest that they read a little bit more up about co-researching in terms of transcendental phenomenology. I'm sure there are articles written on that. It's just not my area of specialization, and it's not something that we really address in doctoral work here at NCU. I hope that helps.
Thank you for that. And that was it for questions.
Okay, perfect. So now we're going to move on to the second standard, which is dependability. And this standard for judging the trustworthiness of qualitative studies refers to the stability or consistency of the inquiry process used over time. This is dependability. To check the dependability of a qualitative study, one looks to see if the researcher has been careless or careful in conceptualizing the study, collecting the data, analyzing the data, interpreting the findings, and then finally reporting the findings in the final report, which is the dissertation. So dependability, the key words are careful, being careful in terms of collecting the data so that the results will be consistent and stable over time. And there are different ways, as with the first standard of trustworthiness, which was credibility. There are different ways, several ways, that the researcher can enhance the dependability of the research. And I'm going to go through each of these 4 different ways. Firstly, through clear presentation of the research process. The more consistent the researcher has been in the research process, and by consistent, I mean something as specific as using consistent wording, then the more dependable the findings will be. We often, as faculty, point out to our students that, for example, a problem statement or a purpose statement should be worded consistently throughout. So even though one may try to be creative and word your problem statement or your purpose statement in different ways in different places, that is not helpful. So consistency is key, and that's one of the ways of addressing dependability, that your findings and your study and the wording is consistent throughout. Another way of addressing dependability is to keep field notes or a journal, and maintaining a record of the research experience which contains useful information is extremely important on a number of different levels. Firstly, it allows the researcher to be reflective and to track your reflections and your decisions over time. Keeping this field notes or journal is also an excellent way of addressing the 4th bullet here, which is an audit trail, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But it's a very, very valuable and useful practice in qualitative research, and I highly recommend that all student qualitative researchers do this. I would even recommend this for quantitative research, because keeping this journal of your own reflections about the research process, whatever it is, you don't have to ever turn this journal in. It's your own way of documenting how you have proceeded and progressed through the research process. And it's very, very useful also in terms of referring back to it when you come to actually present your findings, because the information that you recorded there can be very valuable to shed light on why you've made certain decisions, why you've changed your mind in certain ways, if at all, and for those sort of choices that you make. So that's the third one is field notes.
Dr. Bloomer.
Notes about the research process in general, not just in terms of your own feelings about them and your reflections, but the research process. And that's what the field notes are. Tran, I just thought.
Yes.
Hello.
Could you? You were cutting out a little. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I don't know why this is happening.
That's okay. You were cutting out a little bit during the notes section.
Okay.
Could you just go over that a little bit again, please?
Okay. So
Thank
the
you.
field notes are slightly different to the journal. The field notes are not so much a reflection of your insights and your ideas as much as actual documentation of the research process. And this, again, is very, very important for the audit trail, which I'm going to talk about in one moment, so that other researchers can understand your research process should they wish to. So whereas a journal is more of a reflection on your choices and your ideas and your insights, the field notes are an actual documentation of the research process, what you did, when you did it, why you did it, how you did it, etc. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Okay.
can hear you. Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
And the final way to enhance the dependability is called an audit trail. For example, it's the same as an audit done, like an accounting audit, a similar concept. An independent auditor would review the activities of the researcher through the field notes or reports and see how well the techniques for meeting credibility have been upheld. If the researcher does not maintain any kind of audit trail, then the trustworthiness of the study is severely diminished. So keeping the journal, keeping the field notes, maintaining your field notes accurately and updating them accordingly with all the different processes that you engage in. If you ever asked to submit your work to an audit, then you would have all the information there that would be needed. So if you have all of that, then your study would be considered dependable. So there I've spoken about the different ways to enhance the dependability of the research. And I'm going to stop so that any questions about dependability can be raised, and I'm happy to answer any.
Okay, great. We do have a couple questions. Would you please explain one more time about the researcher acknowledging their bias, but still remaining neutrality and allowing the research to substantiate the study?
Okay. So that's, again, a great question, and one that is often debated and spoken about in social science research, because quantitative researchers believe that a researcher can be objective and neutral. Qualitative researchers acknowledge that as human beings, it's very difficult and sometimes even impossible to be objective and or neutral. Because as humans, we all have our own ideas. We all have our own perspectives on any phenomenon or event or occurrence in the world. It's very difficult to take a neutral standpoint. So qualitative researchers, the way that they deal with this question or this issue is to say, we don't claim to be objective or neutral. This is why I'm not objective or neutral. These are my assumptions. I believe A, B, C, and D. So going into my research, I believe A, B, C, and D, and this may impact my study. It may impact the way I do the research. It even may impact the way that I view the outcome of the research or the findings. So being transparent in that way is the way that the qualitative researcher addresses this issue of subjectivity, objectivity. So it's not to say that I'm objective and I'm neutral, but it's to say I do have subjectivities, being biases, prejudices, or assumptions. These are my assumptions going in. So that transparency is the way that we address this issue. And again, as I said earlier, in the final chapter, I encourage my students, and I know many of the key researchers in the field do this as well, and that is you will then revisit your initial assumptions, which are stated in chapter 1, and address, whether you still believe those things, whether you still carry those assumptions or not, and why, if not why. So these are all ways that the researcher remains very, very transparent. It's not about being objective, it's more about being transparent. I think that's the key word, transparency.
Thank you, and we have a couple more. Can the audit trail be addressed in the dissertation by mentioning that the NCU committee chair has been involved in the process the entire way?
Yes, by the chair being involved in the process the entire way is really important, because the chair is the advisor, the chair is the guide. But that's not the only thing that is needed to ensure that you've conducted the study transparently and in a trustworthy manner. So by also sharing, field notes or sharing ways in which you addressed all of these different aspects of trustworthiness, confirmability, dependability, credibility. Sharing the ways that you've addressed these will ensure that your study is trustworthy. So yes, do state also that your chair has been involved, but that is not the only criterion that's needed, or that in itself is not sufficient.
Thank you. And then we have one more question. Dealing with the previous slide on credibility, in the event there is a difference between what you have as a finding and what the participant expected to see as his point of view, how would you continue to correct the issue?
I would simply state exactly as transparently as possible what the participant told me about my finding and what the difference is between what I interpreted to be and what the participant claims it should be. Because remember, the research is really just about representing your findings transparently, ethically, and in the most representative way. So we really are looking to represent the voices of our participants first and foremost. So if somebody tells us that what we have is not accurate or not completely accurate or not appropriate or not completely appropriate, address that, state that. And, again, it's a matter of the researcher being fully transparent and saying, I'm not a perfect human being. I'm a human being. I have my own assumptions. I have my own biases, and maybe these crept in. Maybe I did interpret this differently based on my own experience, but what is the experience of the participant? What is the participant telling me? That's very, very valuable. In fact, very often participants will say that everything looks great and is in line with their feelings. But when they do point out a limitation or an area that is not completely in line with the researcher, that's a really valuable learning opportunity and a really valuable point in the research to document and to share. Definitely, I just want to say this, it does not imply in any way that your research is substandard or that your abilities as a researcher are limited. It's just purely pointing out that human beings have different expectations, different experiences, different perspectives, and that's really what qualitative research is all about. It's about exploring different perspectives, not trying to find something that we all agree on and not trying to prove anything. Remember, qualitative research is not about proving anything. It's not about facts.
Oh, okay, and we have one more, and then you can move on. The question is, can you please give an example of an independent auditor? Could that be a professor or a clinical colleague, etc.?
Yes, it could be a professor. It could be NCU's IRB. Sometimes the IRB want to see more about a study. They may be confused, or they may feel that something is incorrect or has not been addressed fully. So an independent audit can take place in many different ways and by many different people. It usually does not take place in dissertation research. It usually only takes place if an issue has arisen, or if one of the trustworthiness issues or criteria is in doubt. So remember, if you've addressed all of your criteria adequately and thoroughly and comprehensively, there's very little likelihood that you would have to undergo an audit trail. Okay?
Okay, yep, that was the last of the questions so far.
Perfect. And once again, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who's putting forward these questions. Each and every one of them is extremely valuable and worthwhile and a great learning experience, both for me and for the participants. I hope everybody is taking in these questions and thinking about them, because everybody's perspective on all of these issues is so valuable. The sharing in these webinars is an extremely valuable learning experience. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. So moving on then to the third criterion of trustworthiness, which is confirmability. And this refers to the quality of the findings that you produce through your study. Remember, the goal is not to produce objective findings, but rather to produce findings that illustrate that the researcher has reflectively and reflexively addressed any biases, preconceived ideas, subjectivities, assumptions, etc. The term reflexivity, which is a little different to reflectivity. Reflexivity encourages critical thinking and reflection. And that is something that I've written a lot about in my book. In fact, every single chapter has a set of reflexive questions where the researcher or the student researcher can ask themselves different questions about the way the research was conducted for that particular chapter. I really do believe, and most of the big names in qualitative research today, some of the ones that I listed earlier, Creswell, Denson, Yin, Stake, all of these people talk a lot about reflexivity. There's a lot of writing on it. You can look into the literature and read more about it. As I say, I've written extensively about it in my own book. This is really a key aspect of qualitative research. Again, because the researcher is a human being and fallible, we do need to think very clearly and transparently about all the different choices that we make. Otherwise, our research will simply not be trustworthy. And again, it all comes down to these trustworthiness criteria, once again. So there are different ways that a researcher can enhance the confirmability of their research. The one way is to constantly refer back to the literature and the findings that other researchers have made. Because this serves to confirm your own interpretation. So in our dissertations, there is a section called evaluation of findings, and this is where we refer back to the literature review that we've conducted in an earlier chapter. It's really very important to connect what we have found in our research with prior research and literature. This is a way that keeps the whole ongoing academic discussion in action. Because every single study builds on previous studies and lends itself to future studies. None of our research happens in a vacuum. So one of the beauties of qualitative research is keeping this ongoing dialogue and communication between what we are finding, what we are researching, and comparing and contrasting it with what others have found and researched in the past. Again, for future researchers or future students, when they read your research, they're going to then take that and compare their research to yours. So it really is all part of a greater fabric, like a patchwork quilt in a way. In fact, qualitative research has often been referred to metaphorically as a patchwork quilt because it's everybody's research is interconnected in some way and on the same topic. And again, there can also be a confirmability audit. Similar to the dependability audit that I spoke to previously, this can be conducted at the same time as a dependability audit, where the auditor, whether it's your professor or the IRB or another professional, will ask whether the data and the interpretations made by the researcher are supported by material in the audit trail, are coherent, and represent more than just figments of the researcher's imagination. This is actually a quote from Lincoln and Guber. So do the data and interpretations support the audit trail? Are they coherent? In other words, do they make sense? Are they understandable? And are they more than just a figment of the researcher's imagination? That is key because remember, as humans, we do come in with our own imagination. We do come in with our own assumptions. But what you find has to be more than that. It has to be representative of what your participants have actually told you. And remember, audit trails can include a scrutiny of field notes, reports, journaling, transcripts, etc. That's another thing I'd like to just point out, which is extremely important, that all interviews that are done, whether it's individual interviews or group interviews, which are focus groups, all interviews have to be audio recorded with permission, obviously, in the consent form, and then transcribed verbatim. Verbatim meaning word for word. So in order to accurately represent what our participants are telling us, we do have to have these recordings, which are then transcribed word by word. If not, there is no way that we can state that our research is credible. Remember, trying to sit through an interview or a focus group and take notes, that takes away from your focus on what people are actually saying in the moment. And also, there's no way that you can write or type quick enough to get down every single word in the exact way that participants are making their statements. So audio recording and verbatim transcription is essential. And I'm going to stop there again for any questions about confirmability.
We don't have any questions yet. And then I just want to remind you of that question from earlier, just so that you don't forget it. It was what is the purpose of the research if it cannot be generalized question.
transferability. Thanks for reminding me about that, Fran. I'll definitely address that now. So the final area of trustworthiness is transferability. And this criterion refers to the applicability of findings in one context where the research is done or conducted to other similar contexts or settings. The target context, being your research site, must be compared to the research context to identify similarity. Sorry, the target context being, sorry, let me rephrase that. The target context is not the research site. The target context is your own context. Your own being somebody reading the research. You will want to know whether what happened in the research context can be transferred to your context. Does it apply? Can I use this in my own context? The more similar the contexts or settings, the more likely it is that the findings can be transferable from one to the other, from the research context to somebody's own context. For example, if a student is doing research in a high school with say 10th grade students, somebody else reading the research will wonder, well, I wonder if this applies to my school with my 10th grade students. So the key is you cannot apply what someone is studying. If a research study has been done on 10th grade students in high school, it would be unreasonable to say, does this apply to preschoolers or does this apply to third graders? Because that's not a similar context. That's a different context. But if you are applying it or thinking of applying it to another similar context, that means that the research is transferable. And this is the key, what I'm going to state now, the very final bullet. The readers of the study will have to make the decision whether or not, or to what extent, the study that they're reading about could apply to other similar settings or contexts. So in other words, transferability is determined by the readers of the study, not by the researcher. So whereas generalizability, and I'm going to go further into generalizability in a moment and also answer the question that was posed. Whereas generalizability is something that a quantitative researcher strives to achieve. In other words, a quantitative researcher wants their research to be generalizable to other contexts. With qualitative research, it's somewhat different. Firstly, the term is not generalizability, it's transferability. And yes, you do want your research to be transferable to other similar contexts, but it's not you, the researcher, that makes that determination. It's your readers who will say, aha, I think I can apply this in my context, or no, I don't think this would apply to my context. In other words, it's not up to the researcher to make that determination, it's up to the actual readers of the research. Now, I'm just going to go to the next slide because I think that this will, in a way, answer the question that was posed. And then I'd like the person who posed the question to let me know if it's been answered or if they have a further, if they need further clarification from me, and I'm absolutely happy to do so. So many students incorrectly assume that lack of generalizability is a limitation of their qualitative research, but it's not, because as I said, qualitative research does not strive to produce findings that are generalizable. A study's findings might apply to other similar experiences, contexts, or situations, but you should not claim that your findings are generalizable. Sorry, I see there's a typo here, and I'll change it. It's just, I'll do that. Sorry, Tran. I just want to state, read a quote from my own book that goes as follows. Because findings of qualitative research studies are unique to a small number of particular environments and individuals, it is impossible to demonstrate that the findings and conclusions will always apply or be transferable to other situations and populations. So remember, whereas quantitative research is very, very focused on achieving generalizability with every study that's conducted, the quantitative researcher will understand that each single situation and context is somewhat unique, and that some readers will find that the study is transferable and some readers will not be able to transfer your findings to their specific context. So in answer to the question, I think the question was about whether if one cannot achieve generalizability, does the study still have value? I think that was the question. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But I hope that I've made clear that generalizability is not the issue, but that transferability, which parallels generalizability to a large extent, is what we strive for. But again, it's not up to the researcher to determine that, it's up to the actual readers of the study. I'm not sure if the person has written in again, Tran, have they?
They have not, but we can give them time to do so if needed.
Okay. Are there any other questions about transferability and generalizability? But sorry, just before we go to the questions, I just want to make sure that I address this slide, which is the ways to enhance the transferability of the research. You may have noticed that with all the 4 criteria of trustworthiness, the way that I've presented these is to describe the criterion and then to describe for each one of them ways to address each one. So I hope that that's been helpful. And these are the ways to address transferability. There are several ways. Firstly, using very clear descriptions of the research context will help readers be able to determine if the study applies to their specific context or not. So clear descriptions. Clarity of writing is a reflection of clarity of thinking. You don't want people to say, I don't understand this. You always want your reader to walk away with a clear understanding of what you say and what you mean. Any confusion will lead to people not really being able to determine if the study is transferable to their context because they don't fully understand it. So you don't want that to happen. So clarity of writing is essential. And a term coined by Guber, who is one of the forerunners of qualitative research, is thick description. And thick description of the phenomenon that you're studying and the context in which the study took place is the most powerful technique for facilitating transferability. Thick description enables your readers to clearly and readily understand your study and understand the implications of it. So remember, the more description you give, the clearer your description will enable transferability. Okay, I'm going to stop now again for questions.
I don't see any new questions. And then just as a reminder, we are currently recording this presentation, and I will post that in the comments within the next 24 hours, along with the PowerPoint presentation for everybody.
Thanks, Tran. That's very helpful and very valuable for our faculty and students to be able to access. And as you explained to me, they can also download that. Besides the recording, they can download the actual PowerPoint, which I've presented here, and you can review it or revisit any aspects that you wish.
Yes, that's correct.
Great. So now, having come to the end of discussing each of these 4 criteria of trustworthiness and ways to address them, I want to make this very clear, that application of knowledge is essential in a dissertation. Students should review and describe each of the trustworthiness criteria in sufficient detail so it's evident that they have a firm understanding of each of these criteria. Very often students will give only a cursory or a brief overview of one or more of the trustworthiness criteria, and they may omit to describe how they address that criterion. So that is not sufficient. I would really highly recommend that each one of these 4 criteria be described in detail using citations from the literature, and then describe how you address them in your actual study. If you're writing your dissertation proposal, your DP, and you haven't yet conducted the study, you can still explain how you will address these criteria. Then at the end, when you've actually conducted the study and you're writing up the actual DM, your dissertation manuscript, you would then write up exactly what you did do. So remember, in the dissertation proposal, which is written in the future tense, you're just proposing what you will do, whereas in the actual study, once you've conducted it, you describe what you actually did do. Students must explain how they address trustworthiness by providing examples of how they actually did do this in the research process. So if you did do member checks, explain exactly how you did it. How did you go back to your research participants? What did you ask them? What did they say? What did you say when they told you what they thought? So in other words, all these details are very important, and it all contributes to what I discussed in the previous slide, which I referred to in Guber's terms as thick description. Thick, detailed description without being repetitive, just being very direct and clear, is essential. A reader of your study must be satisfied that you have demonstrated both understanding and application. So in other words, they want to know that you understand the criteria of trustworthiness, the 4 criteria, and the ways that you've applied these criteria. So please bear that in mind. That's really, really essential when it comes to writing your report. Okay, I'm going to stop now for the final question and answer section, and then my final slide after this is a few questions that I have for you. So let's just take the time right now for me to answer or address any questions from our participants.
I don't see any that have come through yet. Remember to use the tools at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A or the chat features.
Okay. Well, maybe people are thinking about these things, because I know that I've discussed a lot of material here. There's a lot to digest. There's a lot to think about. So as long as you're thinking and reflecting on this, that's wonderful. I have a few questions that I'd like to just share with you at the end here. I know that we have about 10 minutes left. I have a few questions for students and a few questions for faculty. I know that we have students and faculty in this meeting. And so these are just some reflective points for you to think about as students and faculty. For students, I'd like to ask you what you struggle with most in terms of explaining trustworthiness. Think about what is most difficult for you to explain these terms. What do you struggle most with in terms of achieving trustworthiness in your study? Again, think about what are the barriers or the challenges that you have faced or you think you may face in trying to achieve trustworthiness on these 4 different levels. Do you get the importance of trustworthiness? In other words, why is it important to establish trustworthiness in your qualitative study? Who is it going to benefit? What is it going to do for you and for your research? And which areas are the key stumbling blocks and why? Maybe you haven't begun your research yet. Maybe you're just thinking about, wow, this is going to be difficult to do, or this is going to be a challenge for me. Think about what those stumbling blocks are and why you're viewing them as stumbling blocks, either before you started your research, or maybe you've even been addressing these stumbling blocks or these challenges. Why are they holding you back? What are you thinking about them and why? So those are the questions that I have for students to think about. Remember, as I said earlier, reflexivity, that ability to think and critically reflect on your own assumptions, your own abilities, the way that you approach the research process. It's really so integral to qualitative research, with the researcher being the instrument. And I also have a few questions for faculty on this call. As an instructor, how do you address the struggles of your students? Many students struggle with addressing trustworthiness issues in their dissertations or their DPs. Many students find it difficult to write up these criteria and to actually think of ways of addressing them. And I hope I've made this clearer in this webinar, but how do you address your students' struggles? What are your best practices to help your students understand and apply these 4 trustworthiness criteria? And as a faculty member, what support do you need? What support do you feel you need in helping your students? Remember, the Academic Success Center and the Center for Teaching and Learning have a wealth of resources and materials that are here to support both students and faculty. So the library as well. The library has got some incredible resources and cutting edge literature that can really help you understand these issues, address them, find ways of meeting these criteria in the most appropriate fashion. So please do reach out and please do seek the resources that are out there at NCU, the ASC, CTL, and the library, because they are here to support you, both students and faculty, and we really have really wonderful resources here at NCU.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. And while you were going over those thoughts, we did have several questions come through. The first is, if a research study is deemed by readers to be not transferable, then what is the value of the study? Is there intrinsic value?
Yes, because as I said previously, not every study will be transferable. Remember, every single context is unique according to qualitative research. So we're not looking to generalize to the broad population. We're hoping that some readers may find applicability and use it in their contexts. But I think when a reader determines that a study is not wholly applicable to their context, they're just acknowledging that it's not a limitation of your study. They're not saying, oh, well, that's a bad study, it doesn't apply to my context. Hopefully they'll understand that it includes some intrinsic value for other contexts, maybe not specifically to theirs. Again, we're not looking to establish transferability unreasonable and inappropriate. So lack of transferability does not diminish the quality of a study.
Thank you. And then we have a few more. Do thick descriptions assist in eliminating any opinions about sensitive issues in research?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question. Sensitive issues, by that does the person mean confidentiality, and issues that, or maybe controversial?
I'm not sure. Yvonne, if you could clarify in the Q&A box, and we'll move on to the next question and we'll come back to yours. Okay. The next question is, if member checking was not addressed in an approved IRB study, would I have to forgo member checking?
I believe so, but I would like to defer to NCU's IRB on that, and maybe even a site IRB. Remember, sometimes you have to seek approval both from, well, you always have to seek approval from NCU's IRB, but sometimes you need site approval as well. Please check ahead of time from the IRBs, both at NCU and your site, if they would need approval in the application for member checking to actually occur. I have a feeling that you would need approval for that, because it means that you would be interacting with your participants another time outside of the research. And I believe that approval would be needed for that, but please do check on that, and you will find your answer from the IRB institutions.
Thank you. The next question is, why are most students doing qualitative as opposed to quantitative when qualitative is harder to do?
Okay, two things there, which could be misconceptions. Firstly, I'm not sure that it's always the case that more people are doing qualitative research than quantitative. I think that there are a lot of quantitative studies being done, both at NCU and out there in the world. So I'm not sure if that's a completely valid statement. Again, that's just my opinion. And the second part of it, just please read that again to me, Tran. If qualitative research is harder to do, is that what it said?
Yes. So basically, they're asking why does it seem like people are choosing to do qualitative as opposed to quantitative?
Again, I would say that that's maybe a misnomer. It's not necessarily so that qualitative research is harder to do than quantitative. Quantitative research has enormous standards of standards as well that are extremely important to abide by. A quantitative study is not just a walkover. A quantitative study has to be done rigorously in different ways to qualitative, but rigorously nonetheless. So I'm not completely sure that that is something that I would agree with. I do not believe that qualitative is necessarily harder or more time consuming. I think that both research approaches, both research designs, remember those terms are used interchangeably, research design, research paradigm, research approach, both of them carry weight. Both of them do need to be rigorous and tight. And even though there are different standards to judge them by, as I said earlier, quantitative research is judged by validity and reliability, whereas qualitative research is judged by credibility, confirmability, and dependability, and to some extent transferability, although that's not like a be-all and end-all decision in terms of quality. Both of these paradigms are and should be treated with the respect that they deserve, and both of them are pretty rigorous in their own way. So I hope that explains my viewpoint anyway on those issues.
Thank you for that. The next question is, should member checks be recorded and transcribed verbatim when done?
I don't believe that that is necessary. It's a good point though. If you're engaging in a formal interview with a research participant, then I've never known it to be recorded. Usually, and very often, and a good way of doing it is for your participants just to write back to you. Then you have their own words written down or typed. Usually that is an easier way to do it than actually setting up another meeting or an interview or in-person meeting with your research participants, which could be a little bit unwieldy and asking a little bit too much of them to meet with you a second time. Usually the transcript or the interpretation is sent to them directly, and they would write back to you. So in that way you would have their words down verbatim anyway.
Thank you. And then we just have time for a couple more questions as we are almost at time. I do want to let everybody know that we don't have a discussion group for this topic, but I think I think if we were to have a thread in the NCU community within the Commons, I think it would be a great avenue for us to continue the discussion. The next question that we have is, if the researcher is the instrument and you have to demonstrate reflexivity, do you avoid I in the dissertation? Do you use the researcher instead?
That again is something that is debated in qualitative research. Some studies, for example, personal histories, narrative research, do use the word I. In case studies, generally, we refer to the researcher. Every institution and every department have different ways of seeing this. I've seen it done very differently in different institutions. It would be best to check with your chair as to what their preference is, and they will let you know what the NCU policy is for a particular study. So yeah, so I hope that answers it. It's not a cut and dried issue. There are just so many different ways of presenting qualitative research, but dissertations also need to abide by the policy of the institution in which they're conducted.
Thank you. And then
I just also want to say one thing, Tran, thank you so much for that offer to set up a discussion thread in the Commons. I'd be very happy to be part of that if we do. And I'd love to continue this discussion with both students and faculty and have a space where people can ask questions about this topic and offer suggestions and resources. That would be really wonderful.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg. We do have a few more questions. We've got three that came through. So I don't know if you have time, Dr. Bloomberg, or if you want me to go ahead and send these over to you.
I have time. Let's just stay on and I'm happy to address.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Possibly the greatest stumbling block for the researcher is their passion about the study and how much they are immersed in it and how much they want others to see their passion. That was the student from before clarifying about the description and eliminating opinions about sensitive issues. Okay.
Well, firstly, I always do recommend that people do a study on something that they are passionate about, because the dissertation process is long and involved. And so it really is worthwhile, in order to keep yourself motivated and immersed in it for this prolonged period of time, to actually research something that is important to you. Thick description is something else, however, and that is in terms of describing your participants, describing the site, etc., describing your processes. But definitely your passion should show through. It should be apparent to anyone reading it that this is a significant study. And in fact, in the first chapter, you do have a section to describe why the study would be significant, and how and in what ways it may impact society or culture or your community. So do keep that passion alive. That's very welcomed in qualitative research.
Thank you for that. Yvonne, if you still need clarification on thick descriptions, please contact the CTL, and I'll make sure that Dr. Bloomberg is able to answer the question to you directly.
Sure.
We had somebody that wanted to thank you for this presentation. As a new student, I am reinvigorated by her willingness to discuss and support doctoral students. So thank you very much for that. So I wanted to make sure that you heard that.
Thank you.
And then we have, it seems to me that transferability is becoming increasingly perceived as unachievable because of diversity issues. If you agree with this, does it concern you? For example, it seems like there is an assumption that unless a person is the same age, gender, race, ethnicity, orientation, income status, etc., then the person cannot benefit from the research. What are some ways to design a study that encourage as much potential for transferability as possible besides random sampling?
Well, firstly, in qualitative research, we don't do random sampling, we do purposeful sampling. So you select a sample based on certain criteria that you as the researcher select. For example, you want to do research on 40 to 50-year-old males who work in business situation in North Carolina. So that would be very, very specific. Now, there are not many other contexts that consist exactly of that population or that sampling. There are not many others who are 40-year-old males working in a business situation in North Carolina. So it's very, very unique. However, you can take from the study what would apply. So transferability is not just about this whole study applies to me. It can be, well, this part applies to me, but this part doesn't. Or I may be able to transfer this aspect of the study, but not that aspect. So in other words, it's not an all or nothing situation. I'd really love to continue talking about this transferability issue because it should not be, lack of transferability should not be seen as a limitation. In fact, I'm even getting the feeling that transferability is not really, should not really go along with the other three criteria. The other three criteria are really about quality. Transferability does not really address quality. It's more about applicability. And these are some really excellent questions that people are asking here because it really gives us a lot of food for thought. But I do want to be clear that transferability, unlike generalizability, which is an all or nothing condition, generalizability means this study applies or can be generalized to all these other contexts. Transferability is what can I transfer? In other words, what is applicable? And yes, we definitely value diversity, and every single situation, every single sample is diverse in its own way. In other words, it is unique in its own way. So we don't want to ever detract from diversity. We don't want any study to be so exclusive that it is not inclusive. So these are really great questions, and I'd love for this to be continued in the comments because these are just really wonderful discussion points that can benefit all of us who are interested in this topic. So thank you so much for asking that. It's really an excellent question.
Thank you so much to that student. That was the last question that came through, and we are just a few minutes over, so I want to be aware of everyone's time. Thank you so much to everybody that attended here today, and thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg, for taking the time to go over this topic. As you can see, a lot of students were able to walk away with quite a bit of knowledge, and faculty as well. So thank you so much. I will have this posted in the comments within the next 24 hours. And Dr. Bloomberg, if you want to send me a new version after you fix that typo, I will get it uploaded in the comments as well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. And Tran, thank you to you and CTL for facilitating these webinars and offering our students the resources for understanding the dissertation process in all its many different aspects. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who took the time to attend.
You're very welcome. We're happy to be here to support you all. And if you have suggestions on topics, please send them our way. Please send them to ctl@ncu.edu, and I will work to find presenters to go over these topics with you today. So have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.